back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively into football season. Take me a long time to say that, but we're here. We're going to be doing the Maryland Crab Cake Tour again beginning next Friday. We're going to be over at Union Brewing to start things off in the local oyster. All that brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Lottery in conjunction with Goodwill Win Donation. I got my Win Donation gear rocking today, as well as our friends at the Restaurant Association of Maryland. Whether the Ravens win or lose this week, Restaurant Week begins next week, and you'll be able to go out and save a little money, get some great food, watch the restaurants all show off. Make sure you're going to restaurantweek.com. Luke is here. It's time to talk football, time to talk about the Jets, time to talk about the Ravens, time to talk about whether Ronnie Stanley's going to play, who's not going to play. Luke, I would say to you, you're out there watching practice, doing all this stuff, and now that I've been excommunicated, what do you learn about what do you think you're going to see on Sunday based on what your eyes have seen in dozens of hours of practice out there? What do you know about the team on Sunday? What's a known factor here? Because I don't even know what I know at this point because they were missing so many of the players last year. I can't even say, well, that guy's going to have a good year or this guy's going to be a stalwart player. I think just getting guys onto the field and getting them moving around on Sunday will be a benefit. And the fact that this preseason's really been kind of thrown away by most teams, I expect it to be kind of sloppy, to be honest with you.
It could be. And one of my biggest takeaways from the preseason for me is I think there's going to be a need for some patience as far as expectations, as far as what this football team is going to ultimately be. And I don't mean that in saying that they're going to start 0-4 or anything crazy like that. But because of what you just laid out there, you're talking about guys coming back from injury. I don't think we're going to see Ronnie Stanley Sunday. He came back to practice this week, but let's face it, first time he was on the field suited up since last September 13th against the Las Vegas Raiders. So is 6 days enough for him to get ready to play football? If it is, then that's a hell of an argument for why do you have training camp and all of this? Because clearly you only need a week to be ready. So
with him, it's even worse because rushing him out, the last thing you want to do is rush him into a game because that's pretty much what he said happened last year.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it was a much more deliberate approach this summer to him returning. But just in a general sense, I mentioned the word patience, and I think there is a lot of unknown. Let's be clear. This team isn't a total mystery. I mean, Lamar Jackson's out there, right? Let's begin with that. We know what he does. We know what the Ravens have been since Lamar took over, and they've won a hell of a lot of football games over that time. So I don't expect the offense to look dramatically different. I am curious to see how the offensive line fares. Whether that's Ronnie Stanley out there, which I don't think we'll see, or Jawan James playing left tackle, Tyler Linderbaum at center, as he's been back on the field and appears to be healthy after dealing with the foot issue. But what that looks like, I am curious to see what the running backs situation looks like. If we see J.K. Dobbins in week 1, if we see Dobbins against the Jets, I still don't expect it to be pre-injury J.K. Dobbins at this point. I think you're going to see him eased back in. And let's face it, I mean, Greg Roman's kind of done running back by committee to some degree or another throughout his tenure. So, it's not as though Dobbins was a guy that was carrying it 20 plus times 2 years ago.
Jamal Lewis ain't coming back carrying it 42 times.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I mean, that's just not how the Ravens are going to operate, at least at this point in time. If Dobbins looks great as the year goes on and is looking better and better, then you revisit that a little bit. But it's going to be more of a committee approach, and they're now in a position where they have Kenyon Drake. They have Mike Davis. So they have some veteran experience there that they hope gives them a little more juice than last year, but still a question there. And for me, defensively, the secondary is clearly the strength, and that's kind of been the way it's been pre-injury going into seasons for several years now. But the big question mark, and this is something that even as you and I are talking now early in the week, could change theoretically, although it's getting tougher and tougher to think that it would change dramatically come Sunday against the Jets. But what does outside linebacker look like? I mean, literally, their initial 53-man roster had 3 outside linebackers on it, and one of those was David Ajabo, who of course went to the reserve list and isn't going to be back till later in the season. So you have, with Tyus Bowser going on the PUP list, he's out until at least week 5. You have Odafe Owe, and you have Justin Houston. Now, John Harbaugh was asked about this last week, and he pointed out, yes, Malik Harrison can go play some Sam. Patrick Queen could move to the edge in certain situations. You do have Calais Campbell who can line up on the edge in given packages, but that's a whole lot of counting on quote positionless defense there at a position that, let's face it, has been a question mark at different times over the last few years. And the pass rush in general has been a question. So I definitely have some questions there as far as what that looks like. But just in a general sense, this goes back to what you were talking about just a few minutes ago. I just have some curiosity as far as how do they come out of the gate because of these injuries, because of the fact that they didn't play their starters during the preseason. Whereas in contrast, not that I expect the New York Jets to be a juggernaut this year. They've got some talent at various places on either side of the ball, but still very much a team that's finding its way. But the difference is, I will say, is go look at their last preseason game. I think they played all but 7 or 8 guys, and I think that was mostly because of injury. I mean, they played their starters. So I think there's a curiosity even for John Harbaugh, even if he would downplay it and just kind of say, look, there's always some mystery to the opener. And there is. That's a true point, because you just don't know. Teams hold their cards very close to the vest that they're not going to show what new wrinkles they have with their offense or what they're going to do defensively necessarily. It's very vanilla in the preseason, but simply because we haven't seen these guys, and in the case of your veterans, they haven't been in a live game environment since the end of last year. Even the guys that were healthy at the end of last year, there is a little bit of a question of what does that look like week 1 on the road. If there's a Jets crowd that's going to be fired up at all this season, it's going to be early in the season, right? Hope springs eternal week 1. You think you have a chance. So you look at that environment and you say, okay, what is this going to look like? I expect the Ravens to win. I'm picking them to win Sunday, but I think there is some curiosity as far as how good will this team be in week 1 relative to later in the season. And that's a question, or that's kind of a statement that you can make about any team, but especially with the Ravens, with the players they have coming back from injury, whether you're talking about a Marcus Peters or a Dobbins, guys that we think, we hope, we kind of sort of expect to be out there for the opener, or whether you're talking about guys like Tyus Bowser and David Ajabo and Gus Edwards and, guys that aren't going to be back till later in the season. I think it's very fair, I think kind of a no-brainer statement to think that this team will be better as the year goes on. But the question is, you want to make sure you're good enough early on. Even if it's a little choppy the first couple of weeks, take care of business. Beat the Jets, beat Miami in your home opener. Go to New England against a Patriots team that doesn't really have the same expectations of Bill Belichick teams of the past, especially with the way they finished up last year. So, you want to kind of use those first few weeks to get your bearings, because then you do have Buffalo coming into town. You do have Cincinnati coming into town. So, that's not to say that they have to get off to a 4-1 or a 5-0 start, but you don't want to be 2-3, right? Because we know how competitive this AFC is going to be this year, or at least we think it's going to be. So, if you want to be in a position where you're playing for having a shot at the number 1 seed come December, you want to get out of the gate on a high note here. So I think they can do that. But again, we've just seen so little of them, and even some, they added DeMarcus Robinson at the very end of the preseason. From a practice sense, we haven't gotten to see Lamar Jackson really throw to him in practice, even those of us out there every day covering the team. So there's definitely some unknown. There's no question about that. But you look at this thing on paper, you look at the fact that even through all their injuries, they were right there in playoff position until Lamar Jackson gets hurt in December. So he's back. That factor alone makes you feel better. But yeah, there's certainly some questions and some positions on this roster that feel a little bit weaker than you'd like it to be. I mean, you have strengths and weaknesses. You always have that. But, there are some elements to this roster that feel a little choppy to me. And it'll be interesting to see how they work through that early in the season, whether it's bringing guys in, moving some guys around, trying some new things. So that's just, again, that applies every year, but that feels like a little more of a heavier theme for this football team right now going into 2022.
Well, I guess the Lamar thing is all over with now, other than how he plays, right? I mean, all the offseason, is he throwing to his guys? Who's going to run the ball? Is he going to sign? Is he coming to camp? Is he liking pictures of him in Dolphins jerseys on Instagram? Is he putting gold teeth up on his Instagram, wanting money and like all of that stuff? I guess this is his time to go out and earn all of that and show that he's that player from 2019. No one with more at stake than him Sunday. Like, right? I mean, in regard to not being signed and all of that, if they're going to win a Super Bowl, it's proven and it's on him. And this will be his time to shine and play in New York City, by the way.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's their best player. He's their most important player. I mean, he's their quarterback, and they've won a lot of games with him I would say under center, but they're usually in the pistol or the shotgun, so not really under center. Although we might see that a little bit more this year. That's something to keep an eye on, as we talked about it a little bit in the preseason. But sure, I mean, I think there's always some curiosity when you're talking about a dynamic talent of his stature, going into year 5 now, the final year of his rookie contract. And, what does that mean? And, knowing that negotiations, barring something really strange, it doesn't seem like we're going to see an extension. I mean, I'll say this, the whole week 1 cutoff thing, if the Ravens want to give Lamar what he wants at some point, whether that's week 5, week 7, I mean, we saw a couple years ago, Ronnie Stanley and Marlon Humphrey get extensions during the season. So it's not impossible, but it's unlikely because Lamar is negotiating on his own behalf. We know that, but he's going to go out there and play. And there should be no shortage of motivation on his end, regardless of what he might be asking for, fully guaranteed or whatever the guarantee is compared to what the Ravens have offered. There's certainly motivation to say, well, I'm going to prove to them that I'm worth what I'm asking for, in the same way that Joe Flacco did that a decade ago. So there are some parallels there. I don't think it's exactly the same by any stretch, but it really is a case of wanting to see Lamar Jackson go out there and play his absolute best football. And a big part of that is tied to the offensive line. It is tied to who he's throwing the football to. It is tied to who's carrying the football other than him, because you don't want him carrying it 20 plus times, too often at least. And certainly that's something we've talked about. We'll continue to talk about whenever it pops up. But
that's for me with the running game this week. What's the over under on him running? 14, 16? You talk about making a bet down at the casino this week. I would bet over under on how many times Lamar runs the ball, and I'm going to bet over on him at this point. I think he'll be running as much as he's run because it's what he does, and it's what he did every time the team got in trouble last year before the injury. It's his instinct. He will run the ball. I think he will run the ball a lot. And I think given the offensive line and given the weapons and given where they are, he'll run more than we want him to run early on. He won't run 8 times on Sunday. Over under's 12.
Okay, over under's 12. I'd take under on that.
Okay,
just because that's about what he averaged. Like he doesn't go. It's rare when he's carrying 20 times a game. Like we've talked about this. Like those are the exceptions. But I would also point out, we probably said the same thing a few years back when they went to Miami to open the season, and Lamar threw 5 touchdown passes. So let's keep in mind, they're not exactly playing a juggernaut on Sunday on paper. I mean, the Jets might be better. They certainly have some talented players. I don't want to completely discredit them or dismiss them. The Ravens have to go up there and play good football.
They don't have to play injuries too before the whole thing.
Sure, exactly. I mean, right, exactly. So, and you're talking about a team that had their second-year quarterback, I assume, is not going to play. I know Salah hasn't dismissed that possibility, but we think it's going to be Joe Flacco. And look, I love Joe. It's a spicy week 1 meeting. Yeah, that's fun. We'll talk about that. But we're also talking about a 37-year-old Joe Flacco, not a 27-year-old Joe Flacco. So, all of that aside, I mean, the Ravens are going to do what they need to do to win the game. If they have to run the ball with Lamar Jackson, yeah, they'll do it because they've shown that. And why wouldn't you? You're trying to win football games. I mean, that you don't want him carrying it 20 times a week, but he doesn't carry it 20 times a week. There are times where that happens, but there are other times where it's not as much. But it is going to come and really depend on the offensive line and what it looks like. And I don't expect Ronnie Stanley out there, but they need Juwan James to do a respectable job. They need him to hold up okay there. I think he can be okay there. They certainly want better from Ronnie Stanley when he's out there, but in the short term, it's probably going to be Juwan James, or it could be Patrick McCary at some point. I mean, so that's still a question mark. The offensive line going on the road, the fact that they didn't play together in the preseason, how much that 1 or 2 series would have meant, I don't know. And Greg Roman talked about that a few weeks ago, and I happen to agree with him on that. I'm not sure what the value is there, but there's always that unknown going into week 1. We can all recall times where a team comes out there and, like the 2019 Ravens, they go out there to Miami and they completely embarrass the Dolphins, to a impressive, crazy degree. And we can all remember some examples over the years of some teams that go out there and lay an egg week 1, not necessarily even the Ravens, just in general. So week 1, there's always a mystery there, and that's what makes it fun. We all have these expectations. We're all making our predictions right now. We all think we know who's going to win the Super Bowl and who's going to be there at the end. And history tells us we'll be very wrong about a few teams that will end up being bad, even though we think they're going to be good. And on the flip side, there are going to be some teams that no one's talking about right now. I mean, think about how we were talking about the Bengals at this time a year ago. We were expecting another last place team and Taylor getting fired and Joe Burrow's knee isn't going to be right and all this. And lo and behold, they're in the Super Bowl a few
I was sitting in the upper deck of SoFi. We were surrounded by Budays and saying, what the hell happened here?
Yeah. So you never really know. And
look at the Orioles.
Right. And that's what makes this fun. And I guess a long story short, I mean, I'm really anxious just to see this team go out there and play. I mean, you see them. Someone like me has the opportunity to see them on the backfields every day, and I think Isaiah Likely is going to be a much bigger part of this offense than anyone expected. Out of a rookie 4th round tight end. But what does that look like when the bright lights come on? And what does it look like as far as these wide receivers now all stepping into a more significant role? I mean, it's not just Rashad Bateman; it's who's going to be the number 2? Who's going to be the number 3? Can James Prochet and Devin Duvernay
in general? I mean, as a 1 and getting rid of Hollywood, this should be a year that he's got 85 balls, right? Like, I mean, in an offense that's not going to throw a lot, this is something where he really is going to have a 1,400 yard receiving season for Lamar to have success. Because if it's not Andrews, I don't know who it's going to be, right?
I think 12 or 1,400 would be very ambitious. I think he should be over 1,000. Yeah, but because Mark Andrews, I mean, keep in mind, Mark Andrews, this isn't talking about, he's a good tight end. He's a phenomenal tight end, and he's a really, really, really good pass catcher that you throw into that mix because he's truly their number 1 receiver, right? I mean, that's evident after the year he's, the last few years he's had. But yes, Rashad Bateman's going to have to do much more. And you look at all the targets that Marquise Brown received last year, and they're going to have to go to someone. So I don't know how many more of those can go to Mark Andrews, realistically speaking. So they're going to go to Rashad Bateman, and they're going to potentially go to James Prochet and Demarcus Robinson. And yes, Isaiah Likely, who, maybe by midseason, we're talking about him as their number 3 pass catching option, when you lump the wide receivers and tight ends together. But yeah, they're expecting Bateman, they're expecting big things. I can't fathom that you trade Marquise Brown if you don't have the utmost confidence that Rashad Bateman's going to step into, being a legitimate number 1. Now, is that going to be one of the best number 1 wide receivers in the league? Well, time will tell on that.
By the way, he was 46 for 515 last year. I mean, I looked up Andrews' numbers just off the charts, right? I mean,
sure.
It'll be very, very difficult for Andrews to have 1,400 yards again, right? Like he might, but that's going to take 100+ receptions again, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just that's a lot to put on your tight end, and especially knowing defenses know how important he is to Lamar and to this passing game. So yeah, I mean, they're expecting big things out of Rashad Bateman, and is it going to look like your typical number 1 wide receiver around the league? No, because the Ravens are going to run the ball a lot, and they do have a tight end that's really special. One of the absolute best in the league. Top 2 or 3 easily at this point, if not the best. I mean, he was the best last year. That's how good he was.
Well, in this offense, he can be the best because they're relying on him. And when he catches, they target him 153 times. He caught 107 balls. If that happens again, they didn't have a successful year last year with that happening, right? Like a lot of that happened at the end with Snoop. Some of that, right? So part of this is maybe not that number, but where are the balls going? Where is this mystery passing offense that we've been talking about for 4 years where finally we're going to really throw the ball a lot? I don't know where that is, and I don't know who's going to catch that ball. And we talked about Isaiah Likely and these other guys. I think we're going to see a lot of what we've seen before, which is why I said Lamar's going to run the ball a dozen times on Sunday, because that's what they do, especially when they don't have Dobbins, Gus Bus, when they don't have Mark Ingram, when they don't have those kinds of weapons, and the offensive line's in question, very much in question before we begin any of this. Yeah. I would say that Lamar will be running, because I don't think they will be in a blowout in the third or fourth quarter of this game. I think it's going to be a close football game.
Yeah, and to be clear, when I said the under, that doesn't mean I think Lamar is only running twice, right? Like, let's be clear about that. So if it has to be that, they will do that. They're going to run the football. I mean, it's Greg Roman, right? Let's be clear. I mean, even last year, they did throw the ball a lot more than they had the previous couple of years, because they couldn't run it as effectively. Their offensive line wasn't as good. Devontae Freeman and Latavius Murray and Le'Veon Bell were too old. They weren't Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. So the Ravens feel that Mike Davis and Kenyon Drake are better than what they had last year. But the upside of this running game, other than Lamar Jackson, talking about the backfield, the running backs, the upside is still J.K. Dobbins getting back to pre-injury form sooner rather than later. I don't think we'll see that in week one. I'm not saying he won't play, but I don't think we're going to see a fully healthy, fully explosive J.K. Dobbins for the opener. But that doesn't mean he can't carry the ball and do some nice things. I mean, we've talked about this before. Jamal Lewis wasn't fully back in 2002 compared to 2003 from the ACL in 01, but he still rushed for over 1,000 yards that year. He was still good. He just wasn't special. So, in the case of Dobbins, what can he give you? And, it might only be 7 or 8 carries, and you're getting that much from Davis, and Kenyon Drake's giving you a change of pace. We'll just have to see how that plays out. I mean, it's going to be interesting, but you made the point, and I wholeheartedly agree. Much more comes back to what kind of push is the offensive line getting? And you want Tyler Linderbaum to look like he belongs as the center. And I'm not lacking in confidence there, but he's a rookie. So what does that look like week one, especially with him missing some time over the summer? So, what does Juwan James look like? What does the left guard situation look like? We think it's going to be Ben Powers. That's how it's trended, especially with Tyree Phillips being waived last week after final cuts, and he's no longer in the organization. But, can Ben Cleveland factor in there? The right side of the offensive line, I think there's so much more confidence and perception of stability there in terms of Zeitler and Morgan Moses. You want those guys to live up to expectations, and I think they will. But we spend so much time talking about Lamar and what happened last year. I mean, it just comes down to it. Their offensive line was bad last year. It wasn't good, and that impacted so much of what they tried to do with their schemed up running game and pass protection, and the things that they found a way for a large portion of last season, and then it fell apart, and Lamar gets hurt and the season's over at that point, for all intents and purposes. So, they're counting on their offensive line to really, if you get a Ronnie Stanley back that's right, and at least somewhere in the neighborhood of what he was pre-injury, and you're hoping that at this point, right? I mean, we don't know, but you're hoping for that. If he is, then I think this can be a top 10, top 12 caliber offensive line in the NFL. But if he's not right, and some other guys are struggling to whether it's James at left tackle, or the interior line and left guard still being an uncertainty, then this feels like an offensive line that's more middle of the pack, or a little worse than that. So that's still a big question. And that's where come Sunday we start to see these questions slowly but surely be answered. So. A lot of curiosity, a lot of unknown, but let's be clear as we're talking about the unknown, because that's the sexy thing to talk about, right? You want to talk about, okay, well, what needs to be better? This team has a lot going for it as well. And I have a lot of optimism about this football team, that even if it doesn't show up the first couple weeks in the way of dominant play, I think this is going to be a team that gets better as the year goes on, because I expect them to get healthier as the year goes on in terms of the guys coming back. Now, fingers crossed, you don't want to have too many new injuries, and they'll have some because everyone does. But I just keep going back to, they have to be healthier than they were last year. I mean, you can't possibly expect or fear a season to be as bad as it was last year from an injury standpoint. People will talk about their training staff and their medical team and all those different things. Go back and look at what they were pre-2021. It's not as though they were having an extraordinary number of injuries. They had their share, just like anyone else. But that alone is why I have optimism about this football team, because I just feel they have to be healthier than they were last year. And that alone should make them better. And then if you answer some of the questions that we mentioned, then I think you are talking about a team that can win this division and get into the tournament. And then we'll go back to the same questions we've talked about the last few Januaries. Can they rise to the occasion? Can Lamar, not just Lamar Jackson, everyone, Mark Andrews had some lousy playoff games dropping passes too. Let's throw out there. So it's not just Lamar, but Lamar is the quarterback, and it comes down to the legacy.
I remember Marlon Humphrey talking about choking, after they lost a couple of years. So, these guys have all lost playoff games now.
Sure.
And there's nobody other than the kid kicking the football that's got a ring, right? Like all of that's over with, other than Joe Flacco. He'll be the other guy on the field Sunday who has a ring.
Josh Bynes is about, but he left. He's left a couple times and come back since then. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, for what these guys are, it's a team full of disappointment and Januaries where they're the 82 Orioles. They didn't win. They haven't won anything. That means something to me, and it should mean something to Patrick Queen, the guys that have been paid. Even if Stanley gets back out on the all these guys that have been paid, Mark Andrews, now it's time to win games in January and set yourself up to win games in January. I don't know if they're good. I don't know anything about this team at this point because I haven't seen them play. Yeah. And that would be true about all the teams in the league, that's what preseason. We didn't know much in the old days when they played a little bit, but at least we saw guys go out there and blow the steam off for a half, 3-4 series, whatever it was, see what they look like, see that they're upright, moving around. You've seen, Marcus Peters run around out in on the backfields and doing a nice job against his own teammates. This is a whole different level on Sunday, though, and I think for the whole league, I mean, beginning Thursday night with the Thursday night game, this is, because of preseason, it's more interesting to me and certainly much more dangerous to be wagering on, I would think.
Well, it can always be dangerous wagering on it, depending on how much you're wagering. But yeah, and I think what's interesting about this is, keep in mind, we did get a little bit of a preview of this in 20 with the pandemic year. There were no preseason games, right? But as I mentioned, there are still some teams that approach the preseason differently. I mean, the Jets played their guys. They didn't play a lot. Let's be clear about that. You're not seeing starters play 3 quarters in games anymore, like maybe you saw 20 or 25 years ago. I mean, those days are long gone, but there are still some teams. Andy Reid played his starters in the preseason.
Mike Tomlin played his starters.
Yeah. Sean McVay hasn't played the Rams starters in 5 years now. I mean, there are vastly different approaches. So it is easy to say, well, they didn't have the preseason in 2020, but everyone was on a level playing field then, right? No one had preseason games. So, I mean, the Ravens, I think what's interesting, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this as it pops into my head, they didn't have as much as joint practices, even, the starters, right? I mean, even last year they had some joint practices that they had. So, there's definitely some unknown, and you always have that because like you said, I mean, the preseason games, it's vanilla. You're running your base. I mean, it's, Greg Roman even joked about this and said, yeah, you can send your starters out there and have them run 4 plays from your basic playbook that aren't imaginative, aren't at all schemed towards your opponent. And you can see what that looks like, sure. But are you really getting that much out of it compared to the injury risk? And that's where the Ravens decided they were going to err on the side of caution. And I respect that. By the way, I agree with that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a potential drawback, especially coming out of the gate. So we'll see what that looks like. As I said, I'm picking them to win. You can check out my predictions at BaltimorePositive.com as we get closer to game day and the weekend and all that. But yeah, there's always that unknown in week 1, and that's what makes this fun, right? I mean, we said it. I mean, you mentioned the Orioles this year in a different sport, albeit, but still completely unexpected. The Bengals, last year, the Bengals could sneak up on people. Now they're not going to be sneaking up on people. And the Ravens, not that I think anyone is completely sleeping on them. I mean, I think you're seeing most experts and predictions. I've seen plenty of people picking the Ravens to win the division over Cincinnati, but there is a sense of what does this team look like coming out of the gate? Guys coming back from injury, guys not getting a lot of preseason, no preseason action in many cases. So, what does that look like against the Jets on Sunday? We'll find out at 1:00, and we'll talk about it after the fact. And if they win, everyone will say genius. Didn't play in the preseason, healthier. That's smart. If they lose, what's everyone going to say? You should have gotten Lamar and those guys out there for a couple series. So that's the way it works, and we'll see how it plays out, and we'll react accordingly.
Luke will be on the scene at the Meadowlands on Sunday. I will be watching remotely because I've been forced to watch remotely. You can read about all that out at BaltimorePositive.com. In my blog, my new blog will be called Columness. You can use that hashtag beginning on Monday as I start to get back into the flow of writing about the Ravens and writing about sports and the Orioles and all that good stuff. All of it can be found out at BaltimorePositive.com. Of course, Luke can be found at Baltimore Luke and Luke at WNST.net, at Camden Yards most of the week, in Owings Mills, doing double duty, and then off to the swamps of New Jersey like a Smithereen or a Bruce Springsteen band member on Sunday. Great football weekend ahead. Lots to talk about. Lots of great guests. Going to do Jets guests this week. Going to have some baseball stuff this week. We have the next governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, on from Costas last week, as well as Pam Wood from the Baltimore Banner, and a phenomenal segment of recon that included Mickey Coachella at the Costas last week. If you haven't checked that out with Don Moeller and I, please do so. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore positive.